I think every single administration from John Major onwards has done something terrible to higher education. Sorry, I'm going to just rant now.
And I remember a conversation with George Osborne, and he looked at me pityingly, and he said, do you want to be the minister who's introducing this tuition fee reform, or would you like the Liberal Democrats to? From the world of the uber-rich to those who are in the squeezed middle, student loans, student finance has become a neuralgic issue. And Rachel Reeves announced in the budget that the salary at which a particular type of student loan, Plan 2 student loans, must be paid back would be frozen at £29,385 for 3 years, starting from April 2027. The reason that this is significant is that what it does is that it creates an additional cadre of people who feel the pain of repaying really quite significant amounts.
Yes.
As I'm sure every listener will know, if you've taken out a student loan and you go into a high-earning profession, then you can pay it off, relatively, not painlessly, but you can pay it off. If you take out a student loan and you find yourself well below this or below this earning threshold,
yes,
then again there is relief. You're not on the hook. But if you're in the middle, then you find yourself paying escalating sums for more than most people I think would have expected to pay when they entered higher education. And I think that it's, in fact, I know that it is feeling a profound sense of unfairness, a backlash not just against this government, but against the whole system of higher education finance. And Maddie, I don't know if you think that my characterization of the victims of this, those people who are neither,
yes,
for the sake of argument, off working for hedge funds, venture capitalists, and all the rest of it, nor are they working for voluntary service overseas. But the vast sort of mass of people who've gone to university and invested in their education and are contributing in other ways, are they right to feel that they're being targeted unfairly?
Yes, they absolutely are being targeted unfairly. And it's also of a pace with other changes in our economy. Fiscal drag now means that a lot of people that would once have been considered probably lower or lower middle are now being taxed as if they were higher earners. But the punitive tax on graduates is particularly extreme. If you look at some of the marginal tax rates, it's something I've tried to raise in articles and on this podcast, I think. The marginal tax rates some graduates are paying are what you might expect for a very, very high earner. And it's often accompanied by perhaps less financial security elsewhere, not owning your own home, living in an expensive city where you're an economically productive citizen, but so much of your meager salary that's not spent on servicing your student loan is going straight onto your housing costs. And the level of the interest rates on these loans is quite astonishing. Yes. I mean, I consider myself very lucky because I'm on Plan 1. I just missed the cut-off point. Plan 1, I think, is quite reasonable, actually. It's repayable. And again, as with the other form of loans, you don't start paying it at all until you earn a bit more. And then once you earn a bit more, you get a bit rinsed. But, eventually you may pay it off, but it's not as painful. And of course, the amount you have to pay is not so great. But I have friends who earn really good salaries, really, like, on paper, extremely successful. And they have hardly made a dent into their student loan because of the amount of interest. I don't understand why students are being, I would say, gouged is the word I would use. I think we can have a small number of the most academic students go to university and it will be paid for by the taxpayer, which is how things used to operate. You cannot have the kind of high proportions of school leavers going to university and it remaining free. But you also can't fleece people with these interest rates. And there are direct comparisons with the way that older people have been looked after. For example, during the coalition years, the triple lock comes in. Maybe it was necessary at the beginning, but the triple lock persists. And the way that they calculate the interest, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's using the RPI measure of inflation rather than the consumer price index CPI. So it makes it much higher. And it's the calculation that is not used for other forms of when they're calculating, for example, how much the triple lock goes up. So I think there's a kind of inbuilt inequity to it. But I don't think it's that surprising because every single administration from John Major onwards has done something terrible to higher education. Sorry, I'm going to just rant now.
Please.
But, John Major, it's under his administration, I think, that the old distinction between the polys and universities is kind of dissolved.
Exactly.
So that's the first thing. Then, of course, Tony Blair comes in, wants half of all young people to go to university. Terrible idea. Obviously, this leads to a massive expansion of the sector and courses that shouldn't exist, probably whole institutions that shouldn't exist or shouldn't exist as the kind of academic setting that they claim to be. And then you have the coalition government coming along, trebles the fees and slaps the outrageous interest rates on them. So, even though I'm not a left-wing person, I've only been on 3 protest marches in my life, but I did go on the one in 2011, the big one in London, because it just seemed to me, even then, outrageous. And the repayment terms have only got worse since 2011.
Just a brief historical footnote to higher education policy, which I must mention this week. Vince Cable was, of course, the business secretary who was responsible for introducing this system of tuition fees during the coalition government when I was education secretary. And you might say, well, Michael, if you were the education secretary, presumably your fingerprints are all over this. But they weren't, funnily enough. I'm not running away from it. I'll take my full share of responsibility in a moment. But the reason it was Vince Cable who introduced it is because when Peter Mandelson was taken back into government by Gordon Brown to be business secretary, he agreed to be business secretary, but only on condition that what was then a separate department for universities and skills and innovation and all the rest of it was subsumed. So he came back to have a bigger empire and to be first Secretary of State. Fast forward. The coalition negotiations of 2010, Vince Cable was going to be business secretary. The Conservatives had said that we were going to take universities away from the business department and put them back in education where they belonged. And I remember a conversation with George Osborne. And I said to George, well, if you're going to make me the education secretary, which, that's wonderful and I'm delighted and thank you, but surely university should be part of it. I'm not sort of empire building, it's just logical. And he said, oh, Michael, you've so much to learn. And he said, firstly, Vince will only accept the business department, or the Lib Dems accept the business department, if it is just as grand as Peter Mandelson's business department. Vince Cable won't accept any diminution in the scale of the business department. And I said, well, why are we giving in to the Lib Dems' sort of vanity and grandiosity on this? And he looked at me pityingly and he said, do you want to be the minister who's introducing this tuition fee reform? Or would you like the Liberal Democrats to? And then there was a Cheshire cat smile on his face. And I realized then that it would be the undoing of the Liberal Democrats to introduce tuition fee legislation when, as I'm sure listeners will remember, they had campaigned so vigorously before the 2010 election against it.
Yes, there was that weird summer where young people who were voting for the first time, and I actually missed the vote because I have a late birthday, but everyone else in my year could vote, basically. And some people kind of, they really felt like Nick Clegg understood them and was listening.
Well, and of course the question is, well, why on earth did the Lib Dems do it? And again, to be fair to Nick Clegg and the Lib Dems, they thought that it was important that they demonstrate that they were not a niminy-piminy party that would shy away from tough decisions. There's another analogy here. During the early stages of austerity, one of the things that funding was withdrawn from was an industrial concern called Sheffield Forge Masters, which was in Sheffield, where, of course, Nick Clegg was the MP. And he said, no, go ahead. I want my hands in the blood. I want to show that the Lib Dems are serious about making cuts. So you can argue that there was a certain self-sacrificing nobility about the Lib Dems and that they wanted to show at the time that they were grown up about power. However, it did for them, and it's left, or did leave for some time, a sense of betrayal. But actually, fast forward to now, I think the bigger sense of betrayal that's felt is by younger voters overall towards the entire political class.
Yeah, and I think they're right to.
Because a system of student fees or tuition fees was introduced. It's blanket. It was thought at the time that there would be significant variation, that elite institutions would charge more, other institutions would compete. But basically, the bill's pretty massive. As you say, the economic return, higher education is about much more than economics, but the economic return that degrees used to confer applies to a smaller proportion
Yes.
of degrees. And
And by the way, I would argue, I completely agree. It's about knowledge for knowledge's sake. I would say the academic return, crucially, is also lower. The quality of these courses, the rigor of the courses, the fact that people who are maybe very skilled in certain areas have a lot to offer, but they're being sent down an academic route that's not for them.
I'll come back
And
to
probably
that.
people that shouldn't have been offered tenure now have tenure. You know what I mean? A whole sort of industry of second-rate everything now exists.
I am less vehement than you about saying that the expansion of higher education was a mistake. I think the way in which it was done was a mistake, but I might return to that in a sec. But I think overall,
that's interesting.
The sense of betrayal, of course, is compounded by the fact that all of this is going alongside the quantitative easing and money printing, which, as we know, contributed, along with a failure to reform the planning system properly, to the prices of assets rising, particularly homes, and housing becoming unaffordable for young people. So you're saddled with debt, and it becomes more difficult to acquire capital. And then on top of that, and again, it's quite a formidable charge sheet, and I can't escape my responsibility for some of these decisions. You have the 2 years of COVID. So if you were particularly an undergraduate during that time, an already
Double
blighted
betrayal.
university experience is pulverized. So it is no surprise to me that you have a generation of people in their 20s now who look at all of the established parties and politicians with scorn and think, well, it's either Zach Polanski or Nigel Farage for me, because you oldsters have screwed me.
Yeah. I mean, I personally do think the university expansion has been a terrible mistake. I think it's created a lot of the problems that we now see at British universities. No one likes to talk about this, but academia's dirty little secret is that there is pressure exerted on them to accept foreign students who pay higher fees, which has sometimes led to the dilution of standards. Often it's for things like master's degrees that are then used to cross-subsidise the other degrees that they offer, perhaps the higher quality undergraduate degrees. But I also think that you can trace a direct line between the creation of the student as a consumer who pays the fees to the kind of entitlement and snowflakery that you see on campuses. People feel they have a right to be safe, to be protected. And sometimes I think there's more pressure on the students to be passed and to be given good grades because they are paying to be
You're buying
there.
a student experience in the same way as you might buy a package holiday, with an expectation that you're going to get all your whims attended to, rather than it being the proper experience of initiation into the best that's been thought and learned.
You're absolutely right also to talk about the political anger that is felt by younger generations. I mean, it's not even Rachel Reeves, when she was interviewed about this a few days ago, she didn't even try to pretend that it's not happening. She said in her response that she didn't think it was that unfair what was happening, but also that these fees were being used to cut NHS waiting lists. So she's explicitly saying, actually, guys, you are just the great piggy bank. We will gouge you and make your life chances materially worse because we have to deal with the NHS.
Yes.
By the way, you rarely use the NHS, but when you do try to access it, you find it very difficult indeed. Because I even accessing the NHS it works against people that have a job. For example, you have to be on the phone at 8 a.m. If you have a job, you may well be commuting at the time that you might get a doctor's appointment, And so young professionals are kind of doubly screwed. They can't get an appointment and they have to pay for it.
And of course, all this is occurring against the backdrop this week of...
and also you're the only people that pay for the prescriptions. So many people don't pay for their prescriptions, but you're the mugs that do.
And resident doctors have voted again to go on strike this week. Again, some of those resident doctors will be complaining about the position in which they find themselves after their years of study, but also that contributes to NHS waiting lists rising. On the whole question of the purpose of higher education and how it might or should be funded, one thing I do think is that it is still the case that there are students out there, school students out there, capable of benefiting from a university education who are still in schools that are so poorly run that they don't get that opportunity. But So therefore, I think there is still a reservoir.
Which is outrageous.
Yes, there's still a reservoir of capable people.
But these people were once served by grammar schools that no longer exist.
There are many reasons why there are still students who got the ability, and if they were in the right institutions, they would have the qualifications to go to university. So, but at the same time, it's also the case, and I think here you're right, that the university experience that's offered to many is counterproductive. My pat, trivial way of dealing with this would be to say that any subject that is taught at university with the word studies in the title should immediately be defunded and excised. So that there is literally, whether it's classical studies, peace studies, women's studies.
Peace studies at the University of Bradford is a classic, isn't it?
Yes. So yes. Any of these things, behind that cheap and meretricious shot is a broader point, which is that if you study maths, the physical sciences, or a rigorous humanities subject, history, English literature, that still adds value, provided it's at a rigorous institution. Whereas if you go for one of these other looser, Vatic, free-floating degree titles, then it doesn't really add much value at all. Politically,
though, this, I think, creates huge issues for mainstream politics generally, because if you have what I think has been one byproduct of the expansion of the sector, which is elite overproduction.
Yes.
Young people leave university having been made certain promises about what their degree would do for them in their life. And then they enter what right now is a terrible graduate jobs market. And it has been made worse by some of the financial changes that the Labour government have made. But the jobs that they were promised no longer exist. But yet, having been to university, many will have, adopted a certain worldview.
And expectations.
An expectation. And they were right to do so because they were made certain promises. And I think young people are being systematically lied to because it's incumbent on them and their fees to prop up some of these institutions that shouldn't exist.
I think without wanting to be unduly pessimistic, I hope I'm not being unduly pessimistic, you have the situation that you've described where you have...
It's so bad that people with really good degrees can't get a job at the moment.
So you have a cohort, a generation, where there are so many people who've gone to university, they've been sold the promise or seduced by the promise of a middle-class lifestyle with certain benefits that accrue in status attached to it. Many of them find that they can't get jobs commensurate with it, even if they're very highly qualified. Some people will have got those jobs, and so some people will now be working for Magic Circle law firms, consultancies, or whatever. But they're now going to find that their jobs are going to be under threat as a result of the march of artificial intelligence.
Yes.
So you have a growing cohort of people in their 20s and 30s, saddled with debt, who've become economic serfs, and very possibly economic serfs without any economic land to till, as it were. And against a background of low growth overall, it is a situation absolutely ripe for populist revolt.
Absolutely.
And you couldn't blame them.
Or I would say more left-wing politics as well.
Yes, by populist revolt. I'm talking about both left and right.
Precisely, but sorry, I know.
Apologies.
But I think it's important because actually, I was saying about how the university sector has been kind of, I think, every administration that's come along has done something to make it a bit worse than how they found it.
Yes.
That means that the mainstream politics has its fingerprints all over the disaster. So people will naturally look for alternative solutions. But the people peddling these solutions don't have an answer either. What they would propose is probably the forgiveness of the debt. But who pays for that?
Yes.
How does the state, amid all its other responsibilities and massive balance sheet that we seem unable to cut in any meaningful way, how does it cope with that? I mean, I think it's a ticking time bomb. I guess that's a cliche, but it's kind of true.
Yes, there will be, as in so many areas, a terrible reckoning because it's a literally unsustainable situation, and one where the pressure, again, because of the triple lock to which we're committed and an aging population, will mean that more and more resources seem to be transferred to the wealthy. So it will only increase, I fear, polarization and division in society.